from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
The definitive source for diagnosing and treating diseases is available now.
The 33rd edition of the Red Book offers tools we'll need as we face what's to come.
There definitely will be a next pandemic, undoubtedly. And anybody that claims otherwise is not telling the truth or is not informed.
But first, it's time for a research roundup from the journal Pediatrics.
I really do hope that our listeners are open to looking at this article and in turn then looking at their open notes and seeing what kinds of things they can do to make them more family-centered and bring everybody together.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well. Let's start today's episode with a look at some featured articles from our favorite journal.
May I say, I've really enjoyed learning a little more about our First Up host these last few months.
I see what you did there, and I agree. Today we get to talk to the First Up guest we ever had, Dr. Louis First.
The editor-in-chief of Pediatrics himself.
Yes, and I wonder if he will tell us the story of when he first met his baby brother. It's been on my mind because my kids all met for the first time on New Year's Day, and it was a total love fest. And in fact, just the other day, my oldest daughter was talking about how happy she is to have Zelda in the family. Louis, was your first meeting with your brother as adorable?
Well, my brother was adorable as a baby and as an adult, and I miss him terribly. He passed away a few years back. But when I first met him, my pediatrician told my parents the best way to have siblings bond is to leave them alone in the room. I was 2.5, and my brother was a newborn. And believe it or not, my parents put us alone in a room. There we were. And as my parents describe it, I came out of the room about 2.5 minutes later, just sort of wiping my hands, and my parents just sort of stared at me as I went back to my room, and they went in the room and they couldn't find my brother. I wasn't prepared for this. I just thought my mother was eating a lot, and they found my brother in the diaper disposal with the lid closed. Fortunately, there were a few diapers there before I did the deed. And from that moment on, we bonded a lot better than the first meeting. So for anybody doing anticipatory guidance, we have had no studies on throwing out the sibling in our journal, nor is there any evidence base for it. So let's not do that.
I mean, how our guidance has changed from leaving your toddler alone with your newborn. I've never said that to a family.
I always tell them to make sure there are a few diapers in the bottom of the diaper bin.
Well, now you know why.
Yeah.
If you're going to throw out your sibling, have a cushioning place to have them land on.
Exactly. It works every time.
With no ifs, ands, or buts. And that's how I dropped them. So there you go.
Okay, well, let's get into these articles. I wanted to start with one that focused on open notes experiences. When the Cures Act final rule was implemented in 2021, we started sharing our medical notes with our families. And as an intensivist, I've always been curious how they are processing and interpreting what they see in the notes. Is Pediatrics offering any insights into this?
We are offering insights. In fact, we're making this article open access to families and to clinicians, basically to everyone, to learn what the experience is like when parents have access through an online portal to the records being written in a pediatric intensive care unit about their children. This was a study by Dr. Selby Chu and colleagues from UT Southwestern, and the goal was to basically do a qualitative analysis, which means they interviewed 20 parents whose children these were children under the age of 12, because if we talked about teenagers and open access, it's a whole different topic. So these were children under the age of 12 who had been hospitalized in a pediatric ICU or PICU for at least 48 hours, and parents were asked to share thoughts about the experience. And what happens in qualitative studies is you keep interviewing parents until you reach thematic consensus, meaning they keep bringing up certain topics and they say, that's the experience we want to share. And two themes came through in this study. First were outcomes. Parents wanted to talk a lot about what it was like to have access to those records. And they talked about the benefits of having access. And you can imagine they got to see exactly what clinicians felt about how their child was doing. They found psychosocial and emotional value by feeling empowered to look in at the record, to trust the team even more. And there were negative consequences where parents looked in that record and said, I didn't quite say that, or you didn't capture what I was trying to tell you this morning, and wondered how they could fix that. Because oftentimes when they were looking at the record, the clinical team was not around. The second theme was about interaction with the record itself, which is interesting because even those of us who are clinicians sometimes have problems interacting with the record itself. But you can imagine they had difficulties that they expressed in regard to understanding content, language, and finding things when there was no one there to guide them through the myriad of notes and labs and buttons to click when they were looking at the online record. But the nice piece of this is when they finished giving their thoughts about these two themes, the authors concluded that basically the positive benefits of having open access to notes outweighs the negative consequences of trying to understand content, language, etc. And the families in this article, and it's full of quotations and full of ideas, provide ideas of how to make the electronic health record more practical and better designed to truly allow family-centered care to occur and to reduce the power struggles that might ensue between a care team and saying, these families are looking in at the record. Let's bring everybody to the same page. So I really do hope that our listeners are open to looking at this article and in turn then looking at their open notes and seeing what kinds of things they can do to make them more family-centered and bring everybody together. It's a great article to do that, and I think everybody's going to learn a lot.
Well, I'm learning a lot right now, and I love getting some of these insights from these families. There's something else I need insight on, Lewis, and that's treating community-acquired pneumonia. As a pediatric hospitalist, this is one of my most common admissions. So after these patients wind up in the hospital, how do I know when they're ready to leave again?
Well, David, you are asking the problem that everybody needs to. In fact, this is probably a harder riddle to solve than the riddle of the Sphinx. Okay. How long should a child be hospitalized with a community-acquired pneumonia? When I would bet if our listeners right now would send to you what the average length of stay is for children who have similar symptoms of community-acquired pneumonia, the variability would be all over the map. So we need a stabilizing force or a stabilizing metric to be able to help us square the deck and figure out is there more consistency of when we want to send these kids home. And the answer is something called time to clinical stability, or the TCS. It's the time from when a child is admitted relative to when certain physiologic parameters normalize. So this was a prospective cohort led by Dr. Madeline Field from the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, who brought together 571 children at one children's hospital who had a community-acquired pneumonia clinically between 3 months to 18 years of age and measured the following 4 physiologic metrics: temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, and oxygen saturation every 4 hours from the time the child was admitted to when they were discharged. And basically, when these 4 parameters normalize, and they define the normality in this paper, you have to be afebrile, 36 to 37.9 centigrade, respiratory rate and heart rate less than the 99th percentile for the standards for age, and the O2 sat had to be in room air greater than 90% without need for supplemental oxygen. When all 4 of those parameters normalize, you call that the time to clinical stability. And their goal in this study was, is there an association between the TCS, time to clinical stability, and severity of disease, meaning more severe than pneumonia, the longer the time to clinical stability, but more importantly, how did that relate to length of stay? And then second of all, when a child comes into the emergency department who may be hospitalized, are there some factors that would tell you this child's going to have a shorter time to get to clinical stability sooner, which means maybe we don't put them upstairs, or maybe we put them in an observation unit first, or keep him in the ED a little bit longer rather than use one of our precious inpatient beds. And so what the authors found was, yes, there is an association between time to clinical stability and severity of community-acquired pneumonia. In all, the time to clinical stability for all of these cases was less than 24 hours for all of these kids, but the length of stay on average was 35.3 hours. And whether you look at mild, moderate, or severe community-acquired pneumonias, every time the time to clinical stability, for example, for mild pneumonia was 4 to 8 hours, but the average length of stay was 18 plus hours. So we're keeping these kids a lot longer than perhaps they should. In fact, the authors looked at when these kids went home, did they bounce back to the emergency room or need to be readmitted? And the answer was less than 8% of the time did that need to happen. So the time to clinical stability is a really interesting metric. And they also found, this is about the factors that might lead you to say, maybe they're not going to need to go upstairs. The younger the child, certainly under 2, the absence of vomiting, having normal capillary refill, meaning maybe they don't need that intravenous, and having, believe it or not, diffusely decreased breath sounds was a factor that meant a short time to clinical stability, meaning when you have diffusely decreased breath sounds, it's not likely to be a socked-in bacterial community-acquired pneumonia, but maybe it's reactive airway disease or a viral process, and you're going to turn out to do a little bit better. Yes, it was one site, one hospital. It's a large number of cases, and this hospital claimed that they're seeing 99% of the community-acquired pneumonias in their particular region. But I think if time to clinical stability were incorporated more in our discharge decision-making, and this article gives you all the things you need to know about those 4 parameters. What happens if they go home with 3 versus 4? Really nothing. It still works. Nobody went home with less than 3 stable parameters. The use of time to clinical stability can really help speed up, I think, safer and earlier and more effective discharges for children and take away those extra hours before we actually do discharge the patient. I mean, yes, it could be waiting for the ride or waiting for pharmacy to send the medications up, but those are long gaps between when a child is stable and when they can go home. So I think this paper is a stabilizing force in our ability to tighten the length of stay for children with community-acquired pneumonia.
Oh, it's going to make such a big difference for families and clinicians when viral season rolls around again. And for this next article, we're really reviewing 375 articles in one. The AAP and the journal are looking at how race has been used in medicine. So several authors, including podcast regulars like you and Alex Kemper, surveyed the last 75 years of the journal to track how often race was cited and how it was described. What did you find?
Well, I want to take it back a second, Joanna. Last year, we celebrated our 75th. We know that because we talked about it on the podcast. But we had an article by Nathan Chomila from the University of Minnesota called The History of Race-Based Medicine in the Pages of Pediatrics. It's a phenomenal and really important article. It's a review of the last 75 years with regard to race-based medicine. But what we wanted to do is add to that in the May issue with another article, as you point out, that looks at basically the use of race, where it appears in articles, and how it's used as a variable in studies. This was a study that was led by 2 of our journal fellows. We offer each year the opportunity for a resident or fellow to spend 1 to 2 years with us learning about the journal after dark, to learn how the journal really works. Actually, there's no big thrill for all of our listeners. But they also get involved in a research project, and they decided to take a look at this along with several of us on the editorial board. And they looked at, as you pointed out, 375 articles by sampling randomly 50 articles from each decade of the journal to see if race was used as a variable in a regular study. And if it was used, was it pointed out that it was being used as a social or a biologic construct, if at all? And then when race was discussed in these articles, was it being looked at perhaps with implicit or explicit biases that could basically represent inappropriate use of race in the course or discriminate against race in the course of the study, whether it was intended or unintended? And the bottom line was there were 147 of the 375 articles had mentioned the word race. 85% of these articles basically had it as a demographic variable. Interestingly enough, 11% described it in the discussion as a biologic construct, which is not something we want to do. That exacerbates inequities in healthcare delivery, it's the wrong way to go. And that was in earlier decades for the most part. 7% in later decades, as you might have expected, but only 7% described race as a social construct. Most of the time, it was just listed as a variable. But the sad part is that even if it was just listed as a demographic variable, when it was then analyzed in these studies, it basically did reflect some biases. For example, there were many articles that we cite that would say 22% of the articles, in fact, mentioned race with bias that might say white versus non-white, white versus, I don't even like these terms, white versus others, doing a white-centric kind of anchoring and not even taking each race, representing each race uniquely and calling it out, and why are we anchoring it to white? So needless to say, transparency is important. And we felt as editors that we wanted to publish this fellow's study. It went through peer review, obviously, so that basically it has allowed and will allow anyone to take some action so this does not happen going forward. At our own journal, we have done some significant work in rewriting our author instructions, our reviewer instructions. We've done several of these since 2020. And also our use of inclusive language. All of these things are front and center for authors. We ask our reviewers to now look at how race is used in each article. And I guess I would sum this up, and I direct your readers to look at all of the details in this article, but words matter. And we hope that putting out a study that looks at how we use the word race, and oftentimes not in the way that it needed to help lead to better outcomes for all children, but how race was used, basically it was promoting inequities. And I hope by having this article out there, we will use race better. It will help readers, it will help authors, it will help reviewers so that together we can mitigate racial bias in the peer-reviewed literature. We're certainly striving to do that in every aspect of what we do at Pediatrics. I encourage people to read this article, look at our author instructions, our reviewer instructions, and then as you read articles in our journal and other journals, really think about the questions we raised and how race as a variable is being used. And hopefully we can mitigate those biases going forward.
Well, before we go too far forward, I want to go back one more time, this time to 1983. That was the year the AAP designed the injury prevention program known as TIP. It was also meant to help decrease unintentional injury in kids, particularly young children. So give us pediatricians some tips. Did it work?
Well, I left the tip pun to you, David, because that's like the $100 pun on the podcast Jeopardy pun board. But
low-hanging fruit.
Right. But it wouldn't hurt to talk about injury prevention by, first of all, saying happy anniversary to the TIP program. The TIP program was founded by the AAP's Committee on Injury, Violence, and Poison Prevention. And for those who don't know the TIP program, and that's something I'll comment on in just a moment, it really was designed to sort of do an ages and stages approach to injury prevention so that we could counsel a family at a particular age and stage when we hear the history of what might be a good injury prevention guideline, and then hand them an educational instruction form in multiple languages that would allow a family to do a little bit more for injury prevention. So Dr. Ileana Perrin from Johns Hopkins and colleagues decided to say, well, that's great, but how effective is the TIP program? And so with that in mind, she and her colleagues put together a cluster randomized trial. And I love this study because it involves I love studies that get our residents involved in trying to take a look at effectiveness of something. This was residents at 4 academic medical centers. They happened to be UNC in Miami, Vanderbilt, and NYU. They were in their continuity clinics. And at UNC in Miami, these particular residents were trained in how to use TIP materials, how to screen and counsel families that they saw in their practice from 2 months to the 2-year visit in regard to injury prevention. And over at NYU and Vanderbilt, they were training their residents in an obesity prevention program. And what the authors wanted to know is whether or not the number of injuries reported from one well-child visit to the next well-child visit was less for patients who were followed by residents trained in TIP versus those who were trained in obesity prevention. So there were about 780 plus parent-child dyads in this. These were kids from 2 months to 2 years. They were split fairly evenly between those trained in 2 sites for the TIP program by residents and 2 got the obesity prevention. This was largely a low-income population of families. And it turns out that at essentially every well-child visit, the TIP sites where the residents had been trained showed significant reduction in the odds of reporting injuries compared to non-TIP sites, even when you control for a variety of confounders. There are some fun facts in here. For example, if you have multiple SIBs in the home, the number of injuries reported by parents were less. But even then, the TIP sites reported less than the obesity prevention sites. And that would either tell me that parents are so overwhelmed with multiple kids in the house, they forget these injuries when they're recalling them. Or number 2, siblings are taking really good care of their younger sibs, which is not what I did with my brother when I threw him out at the time of birth. So I didn't have the TIP program back then. I wish my parents had. But needless to say, every single visit showed an improvement in the TIP trained residents who saw their patients, which I thought was interesting. Do you want to know what the number 1 injury is that comes through this study, whether you got TIP or not?
Absolutely.
Falls, which is interesting because we're publishing this in the spring, but it's falls. But needless to say, you could say that there were some, parents are recalling these injuries, but we ask about injuries whether they have the TIP program or not. So there could say the limitation might be some biases, response bias, but I think the biggest limitation is this was an intention to train residents in the TIP program. And let's go to the real world. In the real world, Parents have agendas. They want to talk to us about things. We only have so much time. How often do we say, oh, let me go print out that tip sheet for you? How many people are still in the tip program? Well, we have electronic health records. And there's nothing to say you couldn't have a prompt come out by what you put in that might remind a clinician, a pediatrician, a family physician to bring out the tip program and make that extra dent that may reduce the number of injuries, many of which don't come to medical attention in a household. So if you want, I'll go to you, David. If you want some tips as to what the tip program is all about and what type of injuries occur at each age and stage, then my final tip of this month's First Up Research Roundup would be to check out this study, celebrate the anniversary of the TIP program, and realize it is an effective program and we should appreciate the work it's done over the years.
Well, thank you for all those tips, Louis. As always, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. But I feel like because we didn't do a punny intro, it just wouldn't feel like First Up with Dr. First if you didn't just leave us with one more pun.
I got to tell you, it's spring, Joanna, David. It's spring. So I have to say, you guys probably remember, what is spring's favorite kind of pickle?
Gherkin?
Oh, so close. So close. No, the gherkin is not spring's favorite kind of pickle. It's the daffodil.
That wasn't actually close at all. That was
No, you weren't. But I wanted Joanna to feel better because you always want to do positive. You want to encourage you want to find the positive strengths in their attempt to answer that riddle. But here's to the daffodil.
The first pickle, you know?
I like one of those on all my praise sandwiches, Louis. Thank you.
Anyway, we sprung through May. June's going to be even hotter. We've got some great articles coming. So it's great to bring these to you. Thanks for having me on this month.
Well, we are thrilled to have you back, Louis, and we will see you in a few months. Thanks. If you want to see any of the articles we talked about in the May edition of Pediatrics, you don't need to wait a few months, though. You can go today to our website at aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll look at what's new in the 33rd edition of the Red Book.
Joanna, do you remember how excited we were about the new Red Book, the report of the Committee on Infectious Diseases?
Of course. It feels like yesterday, though it was episode 59 with editor David Kimberlin. He told us about how much work goes into revising the reference every 3 years.
Right. Every 3 years. And that was in 2021.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Wait, that means another Red Book update is due.
It is. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We are welcoming Dr. David Kimberlin back to the show because the 33rd edition of the AAP Red Book is coming out.
Dr. David Kimberlin, who in addition to editing this critical asset, is also professor and co-director of the Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases and the Sergio B. Stagno, MD Endowed Chair in Pediatric Infectious Diseases, as well as Vice Chair for Clinical and Translational Research at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and Children's of Alabama. Dr. Kimberlin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back. It's hard to believe that 3 years have passed, but I guess they have.
Wow.
Well, David, a lot has happened in those last few years. But before we get into the content, can you talk about the design? I mean, one thing I loved was the systems-based treatment table, but then I think we've also seen some advances in electronic health records and integration with electronic systems. What's coming up for that?
You know, I think that a lot of people really enjoyed that systems-based treatment table, and we got fantastic feedback. It was a new concept for the Red Book when we added it with the 2021 edition, and it was so well received that we've done a couple of things. We moved it to the front of the 2024 edition, so you can look on the side of the physical book of the Red Book, and it'll have its own little black marks on the pages, so you can get to it quickly. We also are giving it a more prominent display or location on Red Book Online. And in fact, really, you mentioned about EMRs, that certainly is part of the overall goal, is to get Red Book content closer to where people are using it, where they need it, where they, if it's a bookshelf, great. If it's a computer screen, great. If it's a EMR, great. Let's find ways to get that material to where the users are and to give it in a way where it's easy to retrieve. And I think certainly Red Book Online has been a tremendous advance and opportunity and platform. And I think the EMRs will be as well over time.
Speaking of content we all use every day, let's look at vaccines. How are you recommending pediatricians talk to parents about vaccines?
One of the things that the Red Book, I think, does very well is when there's not content from the American Academy of Pediatrics, we create it. If there's a space that needs to be filled because it simply hasn't had a policy statement or a clinical report previously, we'll develop it for the Red Book. This case, though, is different than that. There has been a very recent clinical report, I believe, from the Academy. Sean O'Leary, who's chair of the Committee on Infectious Diseases, led that effort along with a lot of other really sophisticated folks in terms of inputting information, contributing to improvements, new suggestions, new manners, new ways that very busy pediatricians and pediatric practitioners can approach families and try to communicate with them about the importance of vaccines. We all know, everybody recognizes, thank goodness, that pediatricians are the most trusted resource that parents have for how to vaccinate their children and for other health-related issues when it comes to their children as well. And so that's a responsibility that pediatricians take on eagerly. The Red Book seeks to channel the information that's in those more dense, more long clinical reports and policy statements, to channel those in ways that are rapidly and easily retrievable for busy pediatricians and pediatric practitioners. And so that's that particular chapter in the Red Book. It's in section 1 of the Red Book. It has been completely rewritten to parallel and match that new document that Sean and colleagues published.
Well, I love that Joanna just asked about vaccines. To broaden that question a little bit, what do you think are the biggest changes we're seeing in the actual vaccine information in this edition?
Well, there have been new vaccines since the 2021 edition. Dengue is an example. Mpox is an example. To some extent, actually, I would say yes, for COVID-19 since the last edition. I'm trying to think about when the publication was versus when the vaccines became available. There are new conjugate pneumococcal vaccines that are available. There are changes on the horizon and new vaccine valency. How many different serotypes, for example, are covered in a vaccine for meningococcus with a pentavalent vaccine that has men A, B, C, W, and Y all together. So there have been a number of developments that have evolved over the past 3 years and that are now in this new edition, again, in ways that hopefully are readily retrievable, not just buried in 5 paragraphs, but are in a table form or a figure form where it's easier to get that information quickly.
And how about emerging diseases? I know some people were hoping that COVID and the vaccine might go away. And what about Mpox? You mentioned that just a second ago. What do we need to know, or can you predict the future on these things?
I remember in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, when I first became really interested in pediatric infectious diseases and decided I wanted to go into it, there were people that, I'm not making this up, they literally said, why would you go into an infectious disease specialty? That's dead. There's no new pathogens coming along. We got vaccines against everything we need to prevent, and we have antibiotics and antivirals against everything we need to treat. I wish that had been correct. It's been a great career. I've loved doing what I've done. But these things are not fading away. I mean, I think if you look back to what we were talking about in the situation that we were living in 3 years ago when the three of us last got together, and anybody just reflects back on the last 4 and 5 years of their own lives, it's pretty clear that infectious diseases are with us and are in many ways ahead of us in terms of developing resistance to antibiotics, to making a jump from another species, to finding new ways of transmitting between humans, and so on and so forth. In the Red Book for the 2024 edition, we, of course, now have a dedicated chapter for COVID-19, and we have a dedicated chapter for Mpox. These are 2 new chapters that we didn't have before. I guess with COVID-19, we incorporated in the 2021 edition in the last waning months of its development, because we were hot and heavy in the early part of the pandemic at that point. But this time we've had the ability to really give it its own thoughtful, dedicated set of pages to provide links to, primarily links, since it's still a rapidly developing situation, or relatively rapidly developing, links to CDC web pages, NIH web pages, FDA web pages, wherever it may be, to where they can find updated, most recent current information. Mpox is less dynamic than that. It's less malleable. Thankfully, the Mpox epidemic that we were seeing in 2022 and into 2023 has receded to some extent. Whether that remains the case or not, who knows? It could very much come roaring back. I worry, David, you asked about what I worry about next. I think I'll say it this way, there definitely will be a next pandemic, undoubtedly. And anybody that claims otherwise is not telling the truth or is not informed. What I hope is that it's not for a long, long time, because that was a hell of a time we just went through. But that said, we need to be ready. We need to be prepared. And I think if you were to ask me what the most likely next pandemic would be, I think it would be with avian influenza, H5N1. And we are prepared because of the investment that has been made with the National Institutes of Health. We have antivirals stockpiled that have activity against H5N1, or at least the strains of H5N1 that we're seeing around the world currently. And we have stockpiles of vaccines that are ready to come out for H5N1. So, we can prepare for this. We should prepare for this, and shame on us if we don't. Maybe preparation will, kind of forestall a little bit of the problems down the road. We'll find out.
I'm already envisioning the next Red Book 3 years from now. But focusing on this one that's just coming out, what entry do you think has seen the biggest change that you think people really need to know about for this edition?
I think there have been a number of things. The addition of the COVID chapter and the Mpox chapter speaks to the disease that those two viruses caused and are continuing to cause. And so that, I think you got, when you think about what's new in the Red Book that is impactful or has had such a major disruption to our lives, I think you got to have those near the top. I also think that there have been some more, mundane kind of viruses, if you will, where there have been some pretty big changes. And some of this shows my bias because, for example, their cytomegalovirus, congenital CMV, is a focus that I've had for many decades now. And we have made some pretty significant changes and recommendations for CMV, congenital CMV, and the treatment of congenital CMV. And so the judgment of the Committee on Infectious Diseases that is what the work product of the Red Book is, and they are now recommending the same treatment, and this is in the Red Book, the same treatment approach for the babies with moderate or severe symptomatic congenital CMV, and that's for 6 months with an oral antiviral drug. But for those babies with isolated sensorineural hearing loss, 6 weeks of antiviral therapy, whereas before they were not recommended to receive any treatment. And treatment can be started out to 13 weeks in either of those situations. So that's a big change. And as you guys are aware, I'm sure that there more and more states, a lot of times through laws, are doing screening for CMV. And that can be universal screening, it could be targeted screening for those that just have hearing loss, and you're looking for CMV in that population. This is going to be something that more and more pediatricians across the country are going to be pulling their Red Book down and saying, all right, now I've got this baby that was picked up by a screening program that didn't even exist a year ago, and they're being referred to me. What do I need to do? And the Red Book addresses this in a new table that has the content that I just went through. I think another big area that is just a shift from before, when we're diagnosing tuberculosis, we have the regular standard TB skin tests, the little PPDs, and we've been dropping the age of the T-spot and the quantiferon, the interferon gamma release assay tests. We've been decreasing the age when those are recommended, so that with the 2021 Red Book, we took it down to 2 years of age. With the 2024 Red Book, there are enough data now to say that IGRAs can be used in any age. And that's going to be a pretty big difference, because then if a pediatrician is concerned about a baby or an infant coming in, parents may have tuberculosis, how do they need to work that baby up? they could do an IGRA blood test and not have to schedule the baby to come or the child to come back in 3 days or 2 days for a TB skin test read. And so that's going to give flexibility as well. I think those are the big ones that come to my mind that might be something that a pediatrician or a pediatric practitioner would want to know. I'll finish with a brief comment because this always freaks everybody out. Head lice is something that it baffles me as to why it gets everybody so worked up, but it does. We have a treatment algorithm figure for head lice, and it was from a 2022 clinical report from the Academy that we incorporated into the 2024 Red Book.
I'm scratching my head now, David. Thanks.
I know, everybody does.
Every time somebody says it. Yeah, I hate that kids get excluded from school for like nits. Makes me crazy.
Yeah.
So, David, can we pivot to something more serious? Syphilis. I'm seeing many more mothers testing positive on our newborn service. I know this is a national trend, but is it changing our approach?
It's certainly making it more familiar to us all, isn't it? I mean, syphilis is rampant across the United States, across Canada, across the world. And congenital syphilis is, obviously, as pediatricians, what we're most focused on. The algorithm in the Red Book has really been about the same, but you may remember in the 2021 edition, it was really hard to read because it was all on one page. The font was something less than 8. And so it was challenging. We've actually, in the 2024 edition, put it across 2 pages so that you can, if you're holding the physical book, you can look across it and be able to follow it where your eyes can actually see the thing. And then I'll also mention that this isn't quite ready for prime time yet, but we are testing an interactive type of interface that would be on Redbook Online, where it works your way down the algorithm step by step. So you go into it, you click, yes, mother was treated, and it goes to the next things, and you work your way down that way to get to the answer of what to do for the baby, because syphilis is just so dadgum confusing. Even in these eras, this period of time when we're seeing so much of it. I always pull down my Red Book or go to Redbook Online to look at the algorithm, or maybe this interactive kind of version of the algorithm. We're test driving it right now before I answer any question when it comes to syphilis.
I'm right there with you, David. And I always joke with my residents that it's clear as mud on that one page. So I'm excited we're expanding it. And David, we could keep you here all day, but do you have one takeaway for our listeners before we let you go?
My takeaway is just an expression of gratitude. The people that listen to this podcast are frontline people taking care of children and improving their lives. Our goal is to help with that. And I hope we hit the goal. I hope we hit the mark, or at least near the mark. If you are seeing things in the Red Book that you think are, certainly if they're inaccurate, let us know if we made an error in some way. But if you think that we could be packaging it differently, if we're not touching on something that's clinically relevant, get word of that back to the Academy. We listen to that. We adapt the Red Book based upon the feedback that we get from the people that use the Red Book, the heroes that are taking care of these most vulnerable among us, our children.
Well, I love to hear that you and the editorial board are listening to your readers and users. And Dr. David Kimberlin, we have very much enjoyed listening to you today. Thank you.
I'm so glad to have been able to spend some time with you. Thank you.
To learn more about the new 33rd edition of the Red Book and to order it if you don't already have it, go to aap.org/podcast.
At the end of every episode, we like to leave you with something positive or enlightening. We call this segment Say Ah. David, what's your Say Ah this week?
Today I'm just happy that my loquat trees finally made fruit. Now, I have to admit the loquat fruit it's a little tart, and I try to offer it to guests, and like once their mouth is done puckering, they're like, yeah, that's good. And then I'm like, would you like more? And they're like, no, that's good. But
I'm sorry, is a loquat a persimmon?
No, they're completely different.
Is different? I don't know what that is, David.
Yeah, no, it is a Chinese fruit tree that was imported to the United States. It has a few little seeds on the inside. It makes a tart fruit that comes ripe in this area at about April or early May, and it is also a lovely ornamental plant. The persimmons, which I also enjoy, are not ripe until November.
Yeah. I think because that's on my mind because we talked about it in November. So I'm going to make my say learning about this new fruit.
I sent you persimmons, Joanna, and I'm not kidding. I will send you some loquats too.
It's no joke that I always say that I'm a lifelong learner, though, because there are things I really don't know. So please, yes, mail me this fruit, and I'll add that my say is that it's spring and summer is coming. So there's going to be a lot of juicy fruit ready to eat.
All right. I'm FedExing them to you. That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll talk about food allergies with Doctors Dave Stukas and Rajitha Venkatesh.
We'll also focus on mental health with the editor of Hospital Pediatrics, Dr. Chris Russell. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.